Today we're going to talk about sustainable forest management. This is one of the oldest academic concepts in terms of sustainability. It goes back to the 18th century when Europeans realized that they were running out of timber. And then a very simple concept was designed. The concept is that you cannot harvest more timber than the forest produces. If you do that, then eventually you're going to run out of timber. Then this is not sustainable. So this is the sort of classic concept in the European tradition of academic thought. But then one has also to consider that indigenous peoples around the world have developed their own concepts of forest management. And just to illustrate that, bringing an Amazonian perspective, we have the Curupira myth, which is a very interesting construct. The Curupira is an entity of the forest that many in the Amazon consider as the mother of sustainability, because when you harvest more than you should harvest, then Curupira beats you badly. So there's a punishment by Curupira if you don't harvest the limit that the forest can produce. So I just like to make sure that whenever you think of forest management, don't only think through the lens of the academic thinking, also consider that many indigenous peoples have their own rules to control the harvest of forest products in general. Let's look at the challenges around forest management. I see 4 big challenges. First is that a large part of timber production worldwide is not sustainable, especially in the tropics. And illegal logging is therefore a very important challenge in terms of how to improve forest stewardship. The second relates to temperate timber management, which can be greatly improved, especially large clear cuts in North America or in the European continent and Russia, where huge areas go through large-scale clear cuts with massive impacts. Third is that we have a fantastic opportunity to sequester carbon in forests, and forests provide the best option in terms of both sequestration and storage because of the co-benefits, especially related to biodiversity conservation, carbon sequestration, and hydrological cycle, and poverty eradication. So we have a big challenge in terms of how to create economic incentives to promote this role of forests. And fourth, and maybe the most important of all of the challenges, is to address poverty in those forest landscapes. There is over 1 billion people who live in forest landscapes who are considered poor according to global standards, and we need to address those social challenges when we look at how to improve the sustainable management of forests. So forest management has to be seen as a part of a broader challenge of promoting the Sustainable Development Goals. There are different types of forest management. First is timber, which is usually associated as the most important forest product. Second is non-timber forest products. And then we have a whole variety of products that can be fiber, fruits, syrup, rubber, all kinds of products that are not timber but come from forests. Ecosystem services, which can be seen as a part of non-timber forest product, but I like to see ecosystem services as something separate because it's new. from an academic point of view, we didn't use to separate, but I think now it's appropriate given the fact that the planet is under such a huge stress as we approach planet boundaries in many scales. So it's essential for our future to address forests as a huge provider of ecosystem services. And there are various types of services. Probably the most important in terms of climate change is carbon sequestration and storage. Second, biodiversity conservation, which is also a major challenge in terms of avoiding a species loss. And third, water conservation, as forests provide an important protection for watersheds in terms of river streams protection and the source of many of the freshwater ecosystems that we have. So forests play a very important role as providers of ecosystem services. And you can have management that is directed to increase the quality or the quantity of those services. How to manage a forest? Well, it's very complex, but I'll try to make it simple. First, diagnosis. Each forest is unique, so you have to understand what is the type of forest that you have in front of you, and this requires a diagnosis. It can be a very detailed technical diagnosis, like a forest inventory, that you measure all the trees and you map all the trees or all the plants. Or you can have participatory diagnosis, that you bring in the knowledge of local people. Or you can have a combination of both. But the starting point is to characterize what is the forest that you're going to manage. Second is design a strategy that is linked to your harvest plan. So if you're planning to harvest timber, is different than if you're planning to harvest non-timber forest products, or if you're planning to provide ecosystem services, or if you're planning to do all of those things in a single place. So before you harvest, sometimes you have to do what we call pre-harvest silvicultural treatments. And this can be thinning, can be control of vines, it can be a variety of activities to reduce the impact of logging and increase the resilience of forests. Then you have harvest. And if it's timber, one very important concept is low impact logging, which is a number of practices to reduce the impact of a tree, like directional felling of a tree so that it doesn't damage as much. And if you're harvesting non-timber forest products, the issue is again how to reduce the impact of your harvest. Number 4 is post-harvest silvicultural treatments. So after you harvest, take care of your forest in a way that you increase the capacity of nature to restore itself. This, in my opinion, is one of the most important aspects, because it's taking care of a forest. Sometimes people don't look at a forest as if it was a garden. And in my opinion, it should be seen as a garden that you prune, that you take care, that you look and you talk to the plants and to the animals as much as you can. Then comes in monitoring. You have to look at what is going on in your forests. And then there are techniques like permanent plots that you have repeated measurements over time, and also you can have rapid appraisals that you use other methods to have a quick sense of how well your forest is doing. But the message is you have to monitor, to keep an eye on what is going on. Then comes in forest protection, forest fires, forest encroachment, and different threats that forests are subject to need to be taken into account, and forests should be protected. And this is very important, especially in light of climate change and increased vulnerability of forests to fires. And finally, one has to look at the whole value chain of forest products. It's not only to harvest, but also see how this process of processing those products, the sale of those products, and all the way to the consumer. And then the concept of certification is important, the concept of fair trade is important, so that the revenues go more towards those who are taking care of the forest than middlemen. I'd like to finish this chapter with a few tips. First, look at each forest patch as unique. Maybe you looking at a landscape, you see, well, this is all a tropical forest, this is all a temperate forest, this is all a dry forest, a savanna. But look closer and you see that each patch is different. So try to be as detailed as possible, as aware as possible of the different characteristics of each patch of forest. Number two, focus on simple management practices. What are the best management practices? Sometimes what is required is not something extremely sophisticated, but just pruning a tree, just taking care of how felling is done, how a harvest of a particular product is done. See how you can improve the quality of your practices through simple methods that can be understood easily by local people. Because oftentimes the challenge is not to educate a forester in charge of that particular piece of landscape, but rather to engage everybody in adopting those practices. Third is use the old rule of thumb of forestry. Small interventions and frequent interventions. Not doing too much impact at once, but rather harvesting gently the forest. Fourth is include local knowledge. Don't look at a forest only through the lens of conventional Western science. Try to make a bridge, an ideological bridge with indigenous cultures and indigenous knowledge. There's a whole wealth of information that can be incorporated in the design and implementation of management plans. And finally, empower local communities and promote engagement of local communities in the challenge of managing forests. It's essential to see that forests are much more than plants and animals. Forests have people, either inside or in the surrounding, and they have to be an integral part of forest management.